Evening. My name's Tracy. I'm one of the General Surgical Registrars here at Dunedin Hospital. And firstly, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for taking the time to come here this evening, especially the males in the audience who weren't put off by the title and were brave enough to turn up, even though they might potentially be the minority. A few housekeeping things. Obviously, if there's any emergencies, then the emergency exit is the door you just came through, or the door behind me. And there's some toilets just at the back on the right-hand side. For those of you who are coming to dinner this evening, we're heading over to Vault 21 in the Octagon straight after the lecture. And dinner will be served at 8, so be on time. And I think a special thanks this evening goes to MAS, who've been supporting us for this event, without which we couldn't have held it this evening. And a special thanks really because they've actually stepped up and supported quite a few events over the last few weeks and months. A Women in Surgery event and a Women in Research event. So it's great to have them here supporting us this evening. And you may have noticed that the University of Otago are here this evening as well, and they're kindly recording this event so that we can use it as a learning resource and use it to disseminate understanding of unconscious bias a bit more widely for those people who couldn't come this evening. So the real reason that I organised this event this evening was to try and encourage the establishment of a network across the region for women in the medical profession to better support and sponsor each other. And I'm glad that quite a few of our primary care and community colleagues could come this evening, as well as our hospital colleagues, because I really wanted this to be an opportunity for us to build better interprofessional relationships and be able to put a face to the name of those people we might briefly talk to on the telephone but never really get the opportunity to meet. I had the pleasure of meeting Angela, Associate Professor Ballantyne, at the VAC's annual scientific conference in Bangkok. And her talk on the topic of unconscious bias really struck a chord, I think, with a lot of the conference participants. And I think every female doctor or medical student who's here in the audience tonight has probably experienced unconscious bias in their careers. And I can't count the number of times that my patients have referred to me as a nurse when I've walked into the room, or after finishing a consultation, they've turned around to the tall male medical student next to me and asked what the doctor thinks. So Angela's going to tell us a bit more about why we unconsciously make these kind of mistakes and how our exposure to programs like ER and Grey's Anatomy have influenced our lifelong beliefs about healthcare professionals and how it shapes our daily working lives. So Associate Professor Ballantyne is a bioethicist at the University of Otago in Wellington, and her research includes exploitation, research ethics, the ethics of pregnancy and reproductive technologies, and secondary use research with clinical data. And she's worked in schools of medicine, primary and healthcare and philosophy in New Zealand, Australia, England and the United States, and as a technical officer for genetics and ethics at the World Health Organization in Geneva. And in 2018 and 2008, she was a visiting scholar at the Yale University Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. So tonight she's going to talk to us about unconscious bias in medicine. Right, let's get this set up. Slideshow, beginning. And there's a clicker. Great.
Thank you so much for coming out this evening. It's really nice to get the chance to speak to another group of people on this topic. The Medical Journal of Australia recently issued a request for a special issue on the topic of is there gender equity in medicine? And a group of my colleagues in Australia, a group of female colleagues, wrote a submission which consisted of one word, which was no. And they received a revise and resubmit from the journal asking for them to clarify their position. And their response was to write an open letter, which is now available, arguing that it's just really unhelpful for the journal to be asking a question like that when the Lancet already this year has dedicated an entire special issue to strategies for addressing unconscious bias, and their position was we shouldn't still be talking about this. So this year I've been doing a lot of talks on what is unconscious bias. I feel like I'm coming to the end of that, so you guys are kind of one of the last groups, and from then on, instead of talking about what is the problem and how do we understand it, hopefully we can all move on to talking about what are some strategies and what evidence are we starting to build about which strategies actually work in terms of improving gender equity and race equity in medicine. So a couple of comments to start with. I met some of the audience members at the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons meeting in Thailand and almost needed therapy after that, having had like dinner after dinner with people talking to me about their experience in medicine. I'm an academic, I work in an office by myself, I only work with people I like. I'm just very naive about what workplaces are actually like. So I want to first of all acknowledge that it's really easy for me to talk about this in the abstract, but the people who have actually broken ground in terms of addressing race stereotypes or gender stereotypes, weight, gender diversity stereotypes, are you guys in the audience. So thank you for all the work that you've done actually in the workplace. Reiterate the shout out to the white men in the audience, particularly the white middle-aged boomers, because you guys have been having a hard time recently. Thank you for being part of this conversation. It's really, it's often not a comfortable conversation, and so I really appreciate that people are kind of open to talking about that. I'm going to make a huge number of generalisations today. I'm summarising very quickly a lot of the social science literature. When I talk about we do this, I'm talking about the population as a whole. It may or may not kind of match with your personal experience, that's fine. All of the references are available in the notes section and can be distributed if people want to follow up in more detail. Otherwise, I'm going to move over stuff pretty quickly. So I kind of fell into teaching this topic to my medical students in 2015 because two things were going on. One, we had a guest lecturer come and speak to the class, a health lawyer, and for that entire 90-minute session, the only students who participated in the conversation were male students in our class. This I noticed and really bothered me. And then I was sitting next to my boss, who's male, and I said to him afterwards, "What was going on with that?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't even notice." And I thought, well, if he hasn't noticed that, it's possible that the students themselves aren't even aware that these dynamics are playing out. So that was happening. But at the same time, I knew the medical students were talking about the big sexual harassment scandal that was going on in surgery in Australia. And that was the case of Carolyn Tan, who successfully brought a sexual harassment claim against a senior colleague at Monash Medical Centre, was awarded $100,000 in damages, so one of the kind of few people who successfully navigated that process, but was subsequently excluded from the medical profession. So applied for 8 subsequent positions in public and private hospitals in Australia, didn't get any of them. And commenting on that case, Gabrielle McMullen, another surgeon in Australia, said that her advice to women in medicine now is that you're better off giving a blowjob than making a sexual harassment claim. And you can imagine the kind of response that that got. So my medical students could see that case and see what was wrong with it, something really explicit like that, but they couldn't, or possibly I was unsure as to whether they were noticing some of the more subtle gender dynamics that were going on in the class. In response to that, went this way. There we go. Nope, just hit it. Oh, there we go. So in response to the Carolyn Tan case, the Medical Association in Australia came out and said, this comment about blowjobs is, clearly inflammatory and inappropriate because we have lots of amazing policies in place that prevent that. And that comment about policies irritated a whole extra group of female doctors. And this is a letter that was published anonymously. As a senior surgeon now, I can definitively state that my gender has not only influenced my career, but in fact has defined it. It was defined when I was denied operating sessions by my unit head because my colleague had a wife and child to support. And it's defined in the quick "my dear" here and the comment about quotas and tokenisms there. It's relentless and it's real. And just because my unit head smiles as he notes that my boots make me look like a dominatrix does not render it any less humiliating. Hear me when I tell you that after 20 years of living every day within this hamster wheel, I am utterly exhausted. So I found this really confronting. I thought, this can't be the work environment that I am preparing my medical students for, and we need to kind of start having conversation about this, at least to prepare them to have the kind of skills to navigate this kind of work environment. To jump to the end of the lecture, so there's kind of a no surprises policy. This lecture is going to make no difference to your unconscious bias. There's very little we can do to actively rewrite our bias, particularly, at my age, I'm 40, I've had 40 years of experience of interpreting the world. So all the solutions rely on mitigating the adverse consequences of unconscious bias. And basically the solution is to switch from system 1 thinking to system 2 thinking. This is a model developed by Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winning economist. So system 1 thinking is fast, it's unconscious, it's automatic, it's really good for everyday decisions, but it's error prone. This is kind of trusting our instinct. System 2 is much more slow, effortful, requires conscious effort, but it's much more reliable. So when we're making decisions about hiring, about promotion, about how we're going to set up policies for how we do blind review of journals, we need to be not relying on our gut instinct, but slowing down our thinking and putting in place mechanisms that try and mitigate our bias. So that's essentially where we're heading in the lecture today. So some definitions to start with. So unconscious bias, cognitive biases or heuristics are basically shortcuts or patterns of thoughts that help us understand the world. They're really useful because they help us to efficiently allocate our attentional resources. So your brain is processing and filtering much, much more information than you're aware of. You simply could not function as a human if your subconscious mind was not filtering this information and directing your conscious mind to focus on specific elements, right? So it's really useful overall. They develop through repeated exposure to, in the case of cultural biases, stereotypes, but essentially bias develops as our brains experience the world and learn to recognise patterns, right? So children have an intuitive sense of gravity before anyone's ever talked to them about physics. And if you've ever had a child that constantly throws their teaspoon off the side of the high tray, that's what they're figuring out, right? What happens? And so they can recognise these patterns, and it helps them in future experiences. I dropped something and I was unloading the dishwasher the other day, and very impressively caught it before it hit the ground. And it made me think, I didn't have to stop and think, is this going to shoot to the roof? Is it going to zoom out? Is it going to twirl in circles, right? I can anticipate where it's going to go because I've got 40 years of experience in the world. But we do the same thing in relation to cultural and social patterns. So when my daughter, for example, looks out at the world and sees that 90+% of world leaders are male, 95% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are male, the principal at her school is male, but all of the teachers are female, she starts to associate the idea of maleness in leadership. And the more often she sees male leaders represented in media or stories or narratives, the more tightly those ideas become linked in a bucket in her head. And then over time, the harder those things are to disentangle. It's really important to understand that men and women share these biases about gender. Different ethnicities buy into these stereotypes about race, okay? So it's not something that men do to women. In relation to gender bias, women can internalise a lot of these expectations, and it actually affects their behaviour, and often in really subtle ways. So one study they did in the US was looking at maths performance and the gender stereotype that women aren't as good at maths. So you get the first cohort of students and you ask them to do a maths test, and that's your baseline. You get the second cohort of students and you ask them to fill out some demographic information before they do it. Even ticking a box indicating your gender is enough to trigger the stereotype that women aren't as good at maths. The female students in that second cohort underperform relative to the first cohort, right? These affect actually the way we operate. Third group of students, you don't ask them about their gender, but you ask them about their ethnicity. If Asian students are reminded that they're Asian, for female students, before they do the test, they overperform relative to the baseline, okay? Same thing works for men, white men, for example. Take white male college students, ask them to do athletic feats like running and jumping. That's your baseline. Next group you take and you say, we're doing this test because we want to see how good you are compared to African American athletes. That primes the stereotype that white athletes are not as, don't perform as highly as African American athletes, and so those white male college students will underperform relative to the baseline. This is called stereotype threat, okay? So bias affects the way we perform, the way we see ourselves, and the way other people see and interpret our behaviour. Bias is problematic in one particular area, okay? My intuitive understanding of gravity is great because as far as we know, gravity is not going to change over the course of my life, okay? So that's a good platform for me to interpret future events. On issues of social policy, particularly where we're advocating for progressive social change, our unconscious bias can become outdated So for example, when we have like a conscious conversation and we set equity goals for an organisation or a field, or as a community we decide to legalise gay marriage, our unconscious bias acts like a historical ball and chain, okay, because it's retrospective. So that's where it's problematic, and specifically these areas of progressive social change, it impedes our ability to move forward as quickly as we would like. Here's a little example for you. So when I put up something like African American teen boys in hoodies, without you having to do anything, your brain will check in that bucket of concepts in your head and start to pull out ideas and images associated with that phrase. They will look nothing like this. So this is a photograph by Miles Lofton. He was a 19-year-old photographer in New York when he took this image a few years ago. And he was responding to a lot of the really negative stereotypes about African American teen boys in hoodies, and particularly those who've been shot by police when they were unarmed. And if you Google, black teens in hoodies, you get a lot of kind of very dark, menacing, often mugshot images, compared to Googling white teens in hoodies, and you get kind of Gap commercial photos. So that little kind of disconnect where you saw this photo and you didn't have any existing bucket to file it in, that kind of like, oh, I haven't seen something like that before, is an indication of the existing architecture that's already functioning in your mind. Lots of stuff that's been written on bias recently. If you want to read about bias generally, these are some great books that I would recommend if you want to delve a little bit deeper. So the first lesson when we're thinking about bias in the workplace is that you have to be really sceptical of your own subjective experience. So one thing that happens is that we experience the world and then we tend to extrapolate from our experience to other people in the workplace, right? This is my experience of what being an academic's like. I assume that kind of applies to other people. But the way people interact with us is always mediated by our physical body, okay? And we treat people differently depending on their gender, their race, their weight, their height, their attractiveness, the depth of their voice. So I've only ever experienced the world through the lens of a white female who's quite slim and tall, okay? That changes the way people see me. It changes the kind of privilege I have. A survey of Auckland lawyers a couple of years ago asked lawyers in Auckland, is there a trend for female lawyers to leave the profession? Now, female respondents, legal lawyers, said 90% agreed with that. Yes, that's true. Only 30% of male lawyers agreed with that statement and said, yes, that's true. So 70% of male lawyers thought, what? What trend? I've never seen such a trend. I've never seen women leave, what? I don't know about this. So you've essentially got people sitting next to each other in a workplace with an entirely different view of the reality of what that workplace is, okay? So the first thing is don't extrapolate too much from your own experience and assume because you haven't seen bias, it's not happening to other people. One analogy I like to use is for hospital people, you're walking down a hospital corridor, and if all those doors open automatically for you, your brain is not going to allocate your attention or resources to counting how many doors there are, okay? It's going to be focused on other important stuff. If you've got to swipe to get through each door, you're more likely to remember how many you've gone through. And if, like me, you're on an academic pass and you're always stuck in the hospital and it doesn't bloody work, and you have to call people to let you get through each of the doors, you've got a much better memory of how many you've been through, okay? Very rarely do we get to step outside our own bodies and experience the world through the lens of someone in a different body. Transgender people are an exception to this rule. So this is Ben and Barbara Bars. Ben Bars was the chair of neurobiology at Stanford, studied at MIT, transitioned quite late in his career, so in his early 40s, and has written a lot on gender in the sciences. Really fascinating if you've got a chance to follow up on his work. So he was obviously really aware of a lot of the explicit gender bias that occurred in the workplace. So recalls handing in an assignment when he was at MIT and the professor saying, well, you can't possibly have written this yourself. Your boyfriend must have written this for you, right? Because there's no way you could have got so much of this right. But what's fascinating about his experience is that it's really only when he transitioned to being male that he became much more aware of some of the subtler biases at play. So 2 examples. One, he talks about this not realising the extent to which he was constantly interrupted as a female until he became male, and then sort of felt like he was surrounded by this bubble of silence, which was really disorientating, where people just waited till he finished speaking until they started talking. And he talks about, second example, giving one of his first lectures as a male and overhearing people leaving and hearing someone say, wow, that was really fantastic. His work is so much better than his sister's. Now, he doesn't have a sister, right? That's just the work that he was doing presented through a female lens, and that's the way the world sees the quality or the competency of that work. So the second lesson is, so be wary of just relying on your own subjective experience, and don't go too much on what your colleagues will tell you to your face. So I have had the experience of speaking to some senior surgeons, over the years who have said this is a little bit confusing because there's a disconnect. It seems like there's this big problem in surgery, for example, around gender. But if I speak to my, female colleagues, they minimise that, or they downplay it, or they don't recognise it. So this kind of seems inconsistent. And my response is often, it's not inconsistent necessarily, right? Because if it's not a safe workplace, you can't necessarily expect people to say to your face what their experience is. I, for example, don't go to philosophy conferences and give talks on unconscious gender and bias. I give talks on big data. Because there's a professional cost to being the person that always raises this stuff. I can come here and speak to you guys about it, because to quote the Labyrinth, you have no power over me, so none of you are involved with any of my promotion decisions. I talk to people in the public sector, I talk to law firms, right, because there's no cost for me raising these issues in that environment. Great book by Renée Edo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Here she argues that as a person of colour, even when you find someone who's a white person who's interested in structural racism and wants to have that conversation with you, as the person of colour, you're still required to prioritise the emotional needs of the white person you're speaking to. You have to do all the emotional and intellectual work to package that message and your experience in a way that doesn't offend the white person or make them defensive, okay? And I think women sometimes feel the same thing in relation to talking about gender issues in the workplace. But luckily for you, you don't have to rely just on what your colleagues tell you face to your face, because there is a huge amount of evidence about unconscious bias. I'm not going to go through all of this. As I said, the references are available. So this is just stuff on bias, and then I'll talk a little bit about medicine in the next slide. So there's evidence on whether we call back people for interviews based on whether their name is male or female, or whether their name sounds like an African American or a white name. Hiring practices you'll be familiar with. I'm sure you're actually probably also familiar with the fact that African Americans are systematically undertreated for pain in America. Treatment for heart attacks was looking at who gets referred on to specialist services based on their gender. I'll talk about the gender pay gap a bit in a minute. It's a generalisation, I actually don't play computer games, we shoot black players more quickly in video games than white players. And interruptions of justices is a good one because it's really recent. So here they looked at 12 years of court transcripts in the US, looking at the US Supreme Court, and patterns of interruption. So we interrupt people who we think are lower on the social hierarchy than us, and we tend not to interrupt people who we think are more senior than us. Over those 12 years, women accounted for 24% of the bench. They were recipients of 32% of interruptions, and they were only responsible for 4% of interruptions, so a real difference there. The most interrupted justice was the only female justice of colour during that period. It was constantly silenced by people talking over her. And not only was gender a really important factor in this kind of workplace dynamic, gender was 30 times more predictive of interruptions than seniority, how long you'd served on the bench. Okay? So it was a really influential factor in terms of women's experience of that workplace. All right, medicine. All right, we're going to go through this kind of quickly. My point is just to give you a sense of how well, this is just touching the surface of all the literature on gender in medicine. So patients typically won't interrupt the doctor because of that power dynamic. The exception is if the doctor is female, in which case both male and female patients will interrupt her more often than she interrupts them. Female patients are more likely than men to have their reports of pain be perceived as emotional. Physicians' gender affects how displays of dominance are perceived by patients. So if female doctors display dominance, that's much more disruptive to the doctor-patient relationship than if male doctors display dominance. This is research from Australia. Female students place more importance on family and lifestyle factors when opting for non-surgical careers, so gender plays a part in some of the workplace decisions that women are making. Research by Marie Bismarck found that there's barriers to women taking on leadership roles in medicine, and these are to do with perceptions of women's capability, capacity and credibility. Really recent study in orthopedics found that 61% of women are still asked illegal interview questions about family planning, for example, compared to only 8% of men. Massive difference there in terms of their experience of the workplace. Transplant surgery, again, really recent, 2019. Letters for male applicants were significantly more likely to contain agentic terms such as superb, intelligent, exceptional, and the term future leader, whereas letters for female applicants were more likely to use communal terms like compassionate, calm, and delightful. We all want our surgeons to be delightful. Again, this just came out a month ago, I think. Female surgeons in Ontario earn 24% less per hour while operating, okay? So this is why some colleagues are getting to the point where they're really frustrated as to why we're still having this conversation, okay? It's really well documented. One thing that I would, if you take one thought away from today's session, I want it to be a huge degree of skepticism about the idea of meritocracy. So basically what unconscious bias says is we aren't judged on the quality of our work, right? The quality of our surgical work, the quality of our academic writing. If you take a paper and you give it to someone and there's no indication of who wrote it, then fair enough, there's such a thing as meritocracy. But we don't exist like that. We exist in human bodies, right? So the way people judge the quality of our work is partly on that work itself and partly on the physical package that we're presented. So this is a lovely study that really kind of emphasises that. This was a study done at Yale University where they got a group of students and said, we need you to make a choice. We have two candidates for the next police chief. One is Michael. He's streetwise, a risk taker, lives alone and has great relationships with their fellow officers. And one is Michelle. She's well-educated, politically connected, really great with the media and has a wife, a spouse and a child. So two quite different profiles. And the students were given no criteria, existing criteria by which to judge them. So the first group of students, we say, who do you think is going to make the next best police chief? Well, obviously Michael, unsurprising. And if asked, students can come up with really, quite sophisticated justifications for that. So they'll say things like, well, we think that it's much more important to have good relationship with the officers and understand what frontline policing is like. Those are kind of the really critical skills for success in this role. So you get a second group of students and you do the same thing, but you switch the profiles. So now Michael's well-educated and Michelle is streetwise. And you say, who do you think would make the best police chief? Well, obviously Michael. Yes, good. Why is that? And we're all good at coming up with justifications. So they'll say, actually, it's much more important to be politically connected and be able to kind of negotiate at those high levels with other government departments to get resources for the police than it is to understand what frontline reporting is like. Okay. So what this shows is if left to our fast thinking, our instinctive response, our own devices, we don't actually look out and pick the best candidate for the job. We look out through a filtered lens, right? And what our brain does is identify the person that most physically looks like previous characters we've seen in that role. Now, the researchers were kind of surprised at the degree of bias demonstrated by this study, so they redid it with 2 extra additions. One, they asked students to fill out a questionnaire about all their conscious views about gender and the role of women in the workplace. None of that was predictive of how biased students would be. Okay? Because there's often a really big disconnect between what we think consciously and what our unconscious bias says. What was predictive was students' self-perceived objectivity. So students who agreed with these statements, my judgment in this study was based on a logical analysis of the facts, and my decision-making in this study was rational and objective, were the students who were most biased, most confident that Michael would be the best person to appoint. So if there's people out there who are thinking, unconscious bias, interesting issue, but probably doesn't apply to me, probably does apply to you, and probably more so. And the reason for that is, if we think we're rational and objective, we have no incentive to slow down our thinking and switch to that system 2 thinking, okay? If we've got a lot of humility about the degree, how we're making decisions, we're much more likely to switch over to system 2 thinking and put in place mechanisms to adjust our thinking. All right, so one of the ways this plays out in medicine is the wage gap. So men tend to choose high-paying professions like doctor, engineer, and CEO, while women naturally go towards lower-paying careers like female doctor, female engineer, and female CEO. This is data from the US, because that's just always a little bit easier to find. This is 2019 data. So male-dominated fields in medicine, orthopedic surgery, neurological surgery, and interventional radiology, where you've got sort of 80+% of men in those fields. Female-dominated fields, obstetrics and gynecology, allergy and immunology and paediatrics. And if we look, these green fields are the highest paid subspecialties, and the orange ones are the lowest paid. So you can see all three of those male-dominated fields are in the highest paid subspecialties in medicine, and some of the female ones are in the bottom, these bottom ones. Obstetrics and gynecology is kind of in the middle. So the gender pay gap doesn't arise. It's not just a question of having, you know, a male and a female person doing exactly the same job. Part of what happens is that men tend to congregate to high prestige, high paying fields, and women tend to congregate to lower paying fields. Now this happens in law as well. So if you look at law, where do we find the female lawyers? In health law and family law. Two of the most lowest paid professions in law. Where do we find men? In banking and finance and civil litigation, okay? So it's not just to do with medicine, this is kind of across the board. You might be thinking at this point, the solution, right, is just to have active recruitment strategies where we try and recruit women into orthopaedics and men into family medicine and paediatrics. So this next study is a real kick in the teeth. This is a study where they looked at 50 years of employment data, a big data analysis study in the US, and found that when women moved into occupations in large numbers, those jobs actually began paying less, even after controlling for education, work experience, skills, race, and geography. So it wasn't a question of when you get women into those fields, they are buoyed up by the prestige and the pay in that field. The very presence of women in that field decreases the perceived value of that work. Okay, so one example was biology. When women came into the field of biology, overall pay decreased by 18%. Another area was designers. When women increased the number of designers, overall pay decreased by 32%. So what's the explanation for this? It's that idea that when we look out into the world and we see people that are representations of people that are brilliant, competent, leaders doing really high value work, that looks male, right? And when we think about the work that women do, that seems to have less value to us, right? And this is kind of some of the ways it plays out. This is really depressing, but I think the point of it is to kind of give you an indication of how entrenched some of these biases are and why quick fixes don't work, okay? Because this is kind of, it's a slippery fish, and it's going to take really sustained effort to start trying to rewire our assumptions about the value of men and women's work. All right, a few final comments before we finish. So these are just little bits of the puzzle I want to put on the table. I don't have time to do them justice, but I think it's kind of incomplete to talk about bias without mentioning these. So that's men, nature versus nurture, and unpaid work. There's a really important agenda around the degree to which gender stereotypes are damaging and dangerous for men. So yesterday was International Men's Day. I actually thought for a minute you might have scheduled the lecture. I had to double check that. No, it was yesterday, not today. All right, so stereotypes around men and masculine behaviour are strength, invulnerability, stoicism, risk-taking, and assertiveness. So 3 examples of how this plays out in really damaging ways for men. One is the suicide rate, so a massively high suicide rate for men. Barrier to health-seeking behaviour, so men are less likely to seek timely care for themselves when they experience symptoms. This is one of the contributing factors as to why men die earlier. So I always say, you know, it's problematic. I feel kind of annoyed that there's the gender pay gap and that we don't get paid as much. But men in the audience should feel really bothered by the fact that the gender stereotypes we raise our children with means that you lose years of your life as a result of some of these views about invulnerability. Social isolation. So research shows that with our male children, we speak much less with them about relationships, navigating difficult emotional circumstances, valuing and kind of navigating social contexts, and we speak to our female children a lot more about that. One of the consequences of this is that women tend to have a much broader and deeper social network than men, and men are often quite reliant on their spouse for their emotional and psychological, to meet their kind of emotional and psychological needs. Big study in the US, 127,000 people, found that married men are healthier and outlive their widowed, singled, and divorced counterparts, right? Because men in those circumstances don't have a broader social network to draw on. Women experience no survival advantage in marriage, so it was kind of a unilateral relationship. In part because women, you know, and again I'm talking about generalisations, tend to have a much broader social network where they can have those needs met. All right, So putting that out there as an agenda. Nature versus nurture. Sometimes at this point it's really normal to think, look, if these patterns are so well documented across so many fields, maybe some of this is nature, and there's a limit to how much we can really expect things to change. So here I would just recommend you look at the work of Cordelia Fine. Testosterone Rex, which is her most recent book, won the Science Book Award in 2017. It is a fantastic read. She's a neuroscientist and philosopher. She argues that, plausibly, the only way to really settle this debate would be to raise children in a totally gender-neutral society, which we don't have anywhere in the world. So that's kind of an unanswerable question at the moment. But what we do know about the mind is that it's incredibly malleable, programmable, and adaptable to its environment. Okay, so kids by the age of 2 or 3 have learnt to speak, which is a reasonably sophisticated skill, and they learn that by mimicking what they see around them. Okay, so children very young can identify and start to mimic gendered behaviour. So often parents will say, we tried to, and I say this to myself, we tried to raise our children in a gender-neutral environment, and by the time they're 5, or 3, they're already expressing, quite gendered behaviour. That's perfectly plausible as a kind of cultural process. All right, the last part of the story is unpaid work. So this is my favourite work-life balance photo. This is me literally balancing my home life on my head while I'm trying to work. This was taken at 6 in the morning when I had got up at 4 in the morning to try and get some work done. It was a day that I was at home with the kids, and the kids were not supposed to get up before 6, but they had, so I was just ignoring them, and my husband snapped this photo arguing, you can't possibly work with a child on your head. I was like, I've been here for the last 15 minutes while you were having a shower, so that is how I work. So I think the point here is that from a personal perspective, I find it really hard to identify degrees to which gender has held me back in my career. I am lucky in that I have a huge amount of flexibility. I have more opportunities than I can say yes to, so it's not kind of a lack of stuff on the table. But the really limiting factor is the degree of kind of cognitive and emotional and physical energy I have when I get through the door. And that totally depends on what's going on in my home life, right? So that's the bit that's been tricky to balance. I have never really had to fight to get more opportunities at work. So that has to be part of a kind of a discussion about gender in the workplace. So this is New Zealand data right down the bottom here, if you can see it. So men and women have relatively equal sleeping time in New Zealand, equal amounts of sport time. Men have significantly more leisure time, and women are doing dramatically more routine housework and a lot more care for household members. And that, for people that want to have children, particularly, really limits the amount of energy we have to lean in at work. All right, so let's start talking about some solutions. Couple of interesting books here. So Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg talks about the degree to which women have internalised some of these stereotypes about gender in the workplace, and actually their behaviour holds them back. There's some useful content there, I think. I wouldn't buy it kind of wholesale, but I found there's some useful advice there. Essentially, she argues, you need to feel the fear and do it anyway, right? Women need to be more risk-taking. They need to be more assertive in the workplace. One thing I did take away from this book was she makes the point that women tend to caveat themselves a lot at work, right? So, once I had read that, I started looking at my emails, and I would write things like, well, I think, in my opinion, possibly, maybe we could consider doing, the following. And so one thing I've taken away from it, for example, is to write that, but then edit out all of the I think, in my opinion, and the caveats before I send it. Anne-Marie Slaughter is kind of the response to Lean In, and so her criticism of Lean In is that it puts too much pressure on women themselves to solve this problem, and that a lot of what we need to be looking about are kind of structural issues of how we structure parental leave, for example, and flexible working hours. And for example, the Royal College of Surgeons is really, I think, at the moment trying to focus on flexible training options that don't just appeal to women, but appeal to people that have kind of lives outside surgery. The Wife Drought is a great read, Why Women Need Wives and Men Need Lives. One of the points she makes here is that women need to, that it's not culturally acceptable anymore for men in a workplace to kind of go off and play golf together and have, workplace conversations there. But it's still politically and socially acceptable for women to get together and complain about how incompetent their husbands are in the house. This was really heartbreaking because that is literally one of my favourite things to do. And the most cathartic things to do. So it was really, for me, really useful for her to point out that engaging in that kind of language is just perpetuating these stereotypes that isn't necessarily evidence-based. So research shows that men's brains aren't as good at multitasking as women unless you put them in the household environment. After a couple of years, they do get better at multitasking, right? So it's a lot to do with the environment we put people in rather than their innate skills. Anyway, interesting material there. What doesn't work on unconscious bias is sessions like this. So, big meta-analysis in 2014 found that education on bias, teaching cross-cultural awareness, or promoting kind of an egalitarian worldview simply doesn't work for two reasons. One, a lot of this is aimed at our conscious mind rather than our unconscious mind, and there's often just a big disconnect there. And two, because of the amount of time, right? So if it's taken me 40 years to build up my mental architecture that helps me interpret the world, then a half-hour talk isn't going to unwrite that. There is some building evidence around strategies that do work, and largely this comes down to that slow thinking rather than the fast thinking. So we need to focus on action rather than intention. There's no point telling people to be less biased or telling them to be good people, all right? They already are good people. So we need to put in place action, targets for workplaces, and then hold workplaces accountable as to whether they're meeting those targets. Collecting data is hugely important because it avoids that whole kind of conversation about people's subjective experience of the workplace, right? And once we've got the data, we can start looking at how to address that issue rather than debating about whether there is an issue. Setting key performance indicators, defining evaluation criteria in advance, again, really helps cut down on that kind of instinctive gut response. I also think we shouldn't have any, so there's like sometimes the fit criteria. Is this person a good fit with our workplace? That in and of itself is just bias, right? It's like, to what degree does this person fit with our existing cultural assumptions about who that should be? Some of the lessons around bias are that, unsurprisingly, diversity in leadership teams or in the workplace makes people uncomfortable. It is less comfortable to have to work with people really outside the group that you're used to working with that bring kind of a different perspective and a different set of skills. But, and this is much easier to measure in the for-profit sector than the public sector, high diversity makes companies that are more resilient and generate more profit, right? So it's uncomfortable sometimes, it's difficult, but overall it improves standards where we can measure that. Blind review is really helpful where you can use that, right, because it cuts down some of the bias. I'm really in favour of targets and quotas for a couple of reasons. One, I'm just really impatient, so it seems like a quick strategy for me. Second two reasons are that point about discomfort. I think sometimes if we have quotas and targets, we get people in, and it gives us experience of working with different leadership styles, of seeing different people present at conferences, and the more we see that, the more we're experiencing the world in a different way, and that is actually helping to rewrite our bias, right? Because bias comes from experience, not from kind of cognitive engagement. But the real advantage of targets and quotas from my perspective is that we are recreating the world that the next generation is experiencing. So if we are actively, inviting speakers to events that represent a diverse range of people, that is a really visible demonstration for medical students or, young doctors around whose voice we want to hear. Great website called biasinterrupters.org has a huge number of kind of resources and checklists essentially around slowing down our thinking. You can just print them out if it's to do with promotion or hiring or job reviews, really kind of fantastic usable resources. But as I said, this session itself, my husband gets really annoyed at me actually, and this is kind of quite a gender thing, that I don't charge for these sessions, particularly when I'm speaking to law firms. And he's like, that is so gendered. You're doing this talk on unconscious bias and you're just holding yourself back. He used to work for McKinsey & Company. Do you realise how much I would charge if I was giving those talks to law firms? I'm like, yeah, I don't want to charge for it. And so my defence is I'm not charging for it because it's not going to make any difference. But he doesn't buy that. So you can make your own call on that. The degree to which it will make a difference is if it prompts you to think about your workplace and kind of actually institute practices that change that. So that's all I have to offer you today, but I'm really happy to take questions, and I'd love to hear about, your experiences of workplaces and stuff. Thank you.